Welcome to the Advance Your Art podcast, where we talk about the journey from artist to entrepreneur and everything in between. You've worked hard to hone your craft. Now take it to the next level with tips, techniques, strategies, and routines used by successful artists to grow their businesses and careers. Now, let's get started and have some fun with your host, Yuri Cataldo.
Hello, Lynna. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm well. Thanks so much for having me, Yuri.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for chatting with me. So I'd like to start off by asking, how do you describe yourself and what you do?
Yes, definitely. I consider myself to be a creativity coach and a guide. What I do is I work with individuals and organizations to help them kind of tap into their creative resources, right? Sometimes we call it tapping into your right brain. Sometimes we call it accessing your intuition and your inner artist for the purposes of sparking innovation, right? And really moving forward.
Excellent. So before we go into some more detail about that, I'm interested in your background because it's absolutely fascinating. You have studied a number of different subjects through your university career. What made you want to kind of go into some of those areas and to continue your education?
Well, at the time I did on it, I can look back and say I'm just a very curious individual and a wanderer, right?
Okay.
I mean, I think at the core of who I am is this wild-hearted artist. And I didn't really, it took me a long time to understand that about myself and to embrace it. I just, kind of have been, I've followed the breadcrumbs of the universe and, picked up that seemed interesting to me. And so I ended up having a very non-linear path. And that included, I started at a pretty young age with writing. My grandmother was a high school English teacher in Oklahoma. She taught AP English, and I think she saw me and recognized that I was kind of a highly sensitive being, and and that writing was a great emotional, putting little books together. And it was an incredible outlet for me, not only a creative outlet, but an emotional outlet. I truly believe that, creativity is great medicine. And so that's kind of where it started. And then I was fortunate. My parents have a little bit of wildness in them too, especially my dad. He loves to travel. And so I was fortunate to go on a few international. My grandmother in Oklahoma was also a photographer. She had a tiny little darkroom in her garage. Literally one person, it was like a closet that she converted into a darkroom. And so she, had a strong connection to photography. And then my parents gave me a camera. And when we traveled, to London and Paris and Hong Kong and Beijing, and I started, looking at the world through this lens and capturing little glimpses. And then I had photography. I fell in love with all of the different, cultures that I was interfacing with. It just, really widened my worldview, and it was wonderful. And so the thread of photography, stuck with me for a while. I studied photography in college. I studied photography at a junior college. After college, I then ended up in photography school. And so that was, writing and photography were probably my, first true loves and passions. But I've always really I've loved mixed media, drawing. I've studied drawing, I'm finding that I am, when I let it, right? So this is a big part of my message. When I allow myself, have this need to express myself creativity. I mean, and it's almost like this, like a need to be outside and be in nature, or a need, then a need we have to, to move our bodies. And if I don't, give it an outlet, if I kind of stick to my task list, and really stay in that left brain place of like, oh no, we've got a lot to do, and, chores and this and that. If I don't give it an outlet, it starts like going sideways on me. And I'll find that all of a sudden it comes out, right? It will, like, I'm finding that this creative entity will express itself in some way. Making art with my kids, which is always great, I love doing that, but I'm finding that I just have this need to be doing something or making something with my hands. It's very therapeutic. And like I said, if I don't channel it, like it will start, next thing you know, I'm like rearranging the furniture in my living room and doing things that maybe aren't quite as necessary. But it's just, and I like it because I think, it translates to this idea that, we're all really innately creative beings. And, and a lot of people express their creativity in ways that they don't necessarily acknowledge or recognize. I mean, I think the kitchen is an incredible place to be creative. I mean, and I know so many people who are like, their creative outlet is in their meals, right? In food prep and in the, in the way that they cook. And I mean, and there's just, and there are a lot of people out there who will tell you, there is, nothing like, a well-crafted meal. And then there are so many people who are incredibly creative with their homes, right? Home design and decor. And then you look around and you see other people who are incredibly creative with their wardrobes. And, and I think it even gets to this other place of where you can be incredibly creative with your finances, right? With your budget. I mean, you'll hear, or I should speak for myself, like I'll hear, more left brain individuals, maybe in more of the math or science areas, and they'll say, oh, I'm not creative. And I look at that and I think, I don't know. Organization or an organization, that maybe doesn't have as many funds to work with, like I guarantee you are moving money around and, in very creative ways, right? So I think it's just kind of redefining this idea of what does it mean to be creative. My creativity was a little less mainstream as I just kind of wandered from one thing to the other and, kind of following my curiosity, giving, myself a chance to explore. To kind of circle back to your question about, my background and how I've studied a lot of different things. And, and even in this past year, I've really done some intense wandering, which has been wonderful. But I think, while my wandering, looked a little bit more, along those creative avenues, right? Whether it was writing, drawing, painting, photography, travel, right? I think travel is an amazing way to be creative and to wander. I think it looks different for everyone, right? I think wandering and really expressing your inherent creativity is different for each individual. But, I think one of the things that I like to, because I went through this, right? I went through this phase of not truly embracing my inner artist, right? Through periods of time where I was just kind of focused on conforming myself to, whatever life was asking at the time, and not, truly stepping into like, well, I'm an artist and that is going to have impact on the way that I live, right? Whether it's,
right,
dedicating 15 minutes a day to it, or just, or Saturday morning, or whether it's full time, whether it's full-fledged, this is what I do. I think there's something that happens when we honor and acknowledge and embrace those creative aspects of ourselves and saying, hey, yeah, I want to give myself time and space to do this, or at least I want to honor when I am being creative, right? And instead of saying like, oh, I'm not an artist, or oh, I'm not a creative individual, say, hey, it may just not be true, right? There may be areas where you're being incredibly creative and you don't know it.
So I'm curious in your own journey, and I know you like to use the phrase wander. What was your own personal journey like
Mm-hmm.
from your early days of like, going to school and kind of figuring out, what your passion is to what you're doing now on the, the creativity and the intuitive guide type of coaching?
Right. Kind of just it's funny the word that I'm like it was really just a wander, more seriously. And so, what that looked like for me was pursuing my fine art and, working or waiting tables. I waited a lot of tables, which was actually a wonderful job and very valuable. And it allowed me, the flexibility that I needed. And then I got to a place where I started, thinking more about a career. It's like, well, what career could I do that would allow me to be more creative?
Mm-hmm.
That I might feel, because I really enjoyed teaching. I was actually teaching English as a second language to adults. And like I said, I loved the teaching. I loved my students. But I was looking for something that was going to give me a little more longevity in terms of a creative outlet. And so I started studying web and graphic design. And that was fascinating because I was learning to code, and that was like learning another language. And I've always been very interested in languages and have loved language acquisition. And that played into, teaching English as a second language. And so I started, learning code, and I did a little bit of freelance work, and I started down that path. And then I ended up, and I was married at the time, and so I ended up having a baby.
Okay.
And that, kind of derailed all of my plans. You have when you have a baby, you start really, kind of wanting to focus on your finances and
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, ooh, freelancing seemed like a good idea, but is it really? And then, I had a baby who was just absolutely wonderful, but, she just really wanted mama. We'll put it that way. Most babies do, but
Yeah.
so I ended up being home. I ended up not working, and I was just with her for a while. And so I got to practice creative motherhood, which,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely, moms are just, I developed my multitasking skills, and so I was home, and then I had another child, and so I was home with them for a few years. And then I got divorced. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it was really critical in, like becoming, I had a couple of life events that, becoming a mother and then, going through a divorce when my kids were really young.
Mm-hmm.
It really, in a lot of ways, I set my artist self aside, right? So I ended up in a little bit of a pendulum shift, right? And so, life got serious, for a while. And so it really was about, what does it look like for me to reenter the workforce and provide for myself and make a living? And I ended up in a very administrative job, a very structured, like be at your desk at 8 a.m. and you cannot leave until 5 p.m. And, and it was very much, it was a great, stable, secure job, the kind of job that I thought I needed to have as a, single parent. And so I get into this job. I was absolutely, and it was definitely a learning curve, but I was absolutely able to do it. Team of people. But what I found is that I was dying inside. Like I just like it was, I know there's an expression that's kind of, thrown around like this soul crushing corporate job. It wasn't a corporate job. It was it was a government job.
Okay.
And like I said, the people there were wonderful and they were gracious, and there was nothing wrong with the job, except that I had taken that pendulum shift. Like I had swung so far on the other side where that just like I was not able to express myself creatively in any way, shape, or form. And just kind of like the intuitive aspect. It was a very analytical job, and so I was a single parent with